Well, thank you for coming to our Youth-led chat series on this cold, cloudy day. At least it's not raining anymore, so that's a good thing. We have an exciting program ahead of us today. Who's excited? Who's read the youth strategy?
Be honest.
Be honest. Who's excited to know about the youth strategy?
Yeah.
Yes. Are we going to work together? Work hard? Yeah. So we're going to have a fun-filled chat series where we're going to do so many different things. Your participation is going to be huge on this. So as you see, I have my wonderful colleagues here. And I'm going to introduce you now to Aishu Narashmadevara, who is one of our youth reps to DPI. Aishu, the floor is all yours. And speak up loud, everyone. Yes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow youth and global citizens. My name is Aishwarya Narasimha, and I'm a youth representative for Medical Women's International Association, which is an NGO based in Vancouver, Canada, dedicated to promoting gender equality in the field of medicine. I'm also a member of the DPI NGO Youth Steering Committee, along with my fellow colleagues and panelists here. Thank you very much to all individuals for coming today to the Youth2030 chat series. Youth are integral and a catalyst force in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Youth engagement has been prominent throughout the various entities of the United Nations system, such as including the Major Group on Children and Youth, and youth divisions at UN Habitat, which is the entity for the environment, and the United Nations Educational Scientific Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO. The United Nations wish to incorporate a strategy that includes youth engagement at all levels in order to incorporate them as actors in the advancement of the goals. The Youth20 strategy is the UN's vision for greater participation and was launched on September 24th, 2018 during the General Assembly. The DPI NGO Youth Representative Steering Committee would like to have a conversation with youth and other actors to discuss methods in implementing the strategy. I would like to pass the floor to the moderator, Rosleni Ubinas, to commence the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aishu. That was amazing. Great background information for all of us. So, like Aishu said, my name is Rosleni Ubinas, and I'm with the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is United States. I'm a youth representative there. I'm also on a youth steering committee here for DPI NGO, and I'll be your moderator for today. And we're gonna just jump right into the discussion because Aishu gave such a great background that I have nothing else to say. So here to my left, I have Jadea Spencer. She is the NGO youth representative for DPI for International Youth Leadership Institute. Let's give her a round. And to my right, I have Erlene Cruz, NGO Youth Representative to DPI also, and Service International, and we're going to start. Who wants to start? Hi, Erlene. What's up? Hello. Right, class. Thank you, Jadea. We keep each other accountable here, and it's a very informal discussion, as if you guys have any questions or comments, we're going to get hold of those later. So, ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Very many thanks for having me here. Thanks for coming, even though it's getting colder and colder, and our need for hibernation increases as it gets colder. So thanks for coming out. My name is Erlene, as Lenny mentioned, and it's a true pleasure to be here today as a fellow youth representative. I haven't been involved for as long as some of my colleagues, but it's a true pleasure to be able to be here and to sit and to speak. So it's an example that this office truly walks the walk. They don't only speak youth, they definitely allow youth to be at the helm and to share their voices, so it's a true pleasure to be here. Someday I hope that we won't need to use any definitions or any demographical terms to define each other. Someday I hope that we don't have to talk about youth or the elderly or low income or developing. Someday I hope that we can define each other by who we truly are, and it's a very multifaceted, multidimensional way of existing, right? But humans like to define things because it's our way of understanding things. And when we define things, things actually do come to fruition. So it makes sense that we categorize things, that we use order to achieve different ways of engaging with one another. With that said, the document rightfully states that youth is defined within the walls of the document as someone between the ages of 10 to 24, but it definitely encompasses people outside of that realm, understanding that culturally youth can be much older and much younger than those ages, right? The document also states that we need a multifaceted, multidimensional approach to solving problems, and it includes youth, but is not limited to youth. It includes the people who are facing the challenges themselves. They often come up with solutions for their own problems, and so to come up with solutions, you need to engage the people that are certainly going to be benefiting from those solutions. And youth make up one of the largest populations of our planet, and the largest youth population in the entire history of the universe, 1.8 billion. So that's something that I'm sure a lot of us have heard about, but it's only going to continue to increase as our population increases, because we have the largest population that has ever existed. And we rightfully heard from someone during our orientation that we're not advocating for decreasing the population, because an increase in population certainly helps to combat a lot of problems as well, but it's about managing that. And youth are certainly a part of the discussion because we are so large and so strong. We today are discussing this youth declaration, of course, but we have to discuss two documents also that came before it, and that were produced by youth and for youth, coming right out of this office. I'm sure many of you, especially if you attended the conference, had the chance to look at the youth declaration that was produced in Gyeongju in South Korea, and most recently here in New York. And I know my colleague Judea will go into more details about that. But this document here was produced by the Office of the Secretary General, and in collaboration with many UN entities, as a way to integrate youth in all aspects of the UN's work in all of the agencies based in New York, and of course outside of New York, where the UN has a stronghold. And the goal of the document, as I mentioned, is to most certainly engage youth. It has five priorities actually, so 4 + 1. And those priorities are to give youth a voice. Most certainly, if you don't let me speak, then you won't be able to hear me. And if you don't hear me, then you can't engage with me. You can't have that bilateral discussion that's, so strongly advocated for all the time. If you don't bring people together, then you can't come about with solutions together. And so the UN does that well, right? It stands as a convener of people, of entities, of governments. So in this document, it stands for a convener of young voices. So that's the first thing. It aims to then amplify those voices by giving people the chance to education. If you don't educate people, then their voices will have some kind of validity to them, right? Certainly, you have education even by just being alive. You are educated by your environment, but a formal education, whatever that means to any respective culture, certainly gives your voice some validity and the ability to strengthen your voice. So that's number 2, and it's very important. Number 3 talks about resources. If you don't put money behind youth and youth strategies and youth efforts and youth developments, nothing is going to happen. Let's be real, a lot can be done without money, but without money and without resources, more strongly, then you can't achieve a lot of what youth want to achieve. So we need to make sure that these youth have economic opportunities, that these youth are not just coming up with good ideas, but are getting funding behind those ideas so that they can go out and execute. So whenever we talk about something here, it's like, okay, let's do it. Great. How are we going to get the funding? Where are we going to get the funding? That's what I'm all about, because quite frankly, without that, it's not going to happen. So it's very, very important, and I'm very glad that they write that here in the document very forwardly. This is to be complemented by strong civic participation in the government. Great, you have funding, you have a great idea, but if the government is against it and says, you know what, we're not going to help you promote this within or outside of the walls of this country, then it absolutely does not allow those voices to continue. It stifles the voices, and it stifles these ideas that are very necessary to promoting growth. Last but not least, it speaks about promoting peaceful societies and youth engagement in those peaceful societies. If you don't have peace, then the voices behind those ideas, the funding behind those ideas, the governments themselves have no validity. So it's important to have peaceful societies so that whatever is produced remains, continues, and is strengthened. I think I'll stop there talking about the summary for the Youth Declaration, but I think that I'm very much looking forward to learning as well from my colleague Judea, who will speak to the declaration, and I know she was one of the many who were having many sleepless nights. There are pictures of people literally on the floor writing this document. So I don't know where it is, but we can find it for you if you want proof.
Or we can not.
Or we can not. But I know that my colleagues, especially some in this room, Steve, I don't know where he is, worked really hard on it. So it's a pleasure to elevate that work here together. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for that overview. This document, the Youth2030 strategy, is a document that was pulled together by the Youth Envoy's office, who was commissioned directly, as Erlene said, from the Secretary General himself, in order to create this strategy that, in essence, is based upon like the principle of what will it take around the world in order to create a world where all youth everywhere can thrive. Like, what will it take to improve the lives and enhance the lives of young people everywhere? And how might we leverage the power that young people have in order to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we have by the year 2030? As Erlene mentioned, like since youth are like one of the largest and most fast-growing populations of people on our planet, right now at 1.8 billion, and I've learned that some countries even have like 75% of their populace are under the age of 25, which is like, wow. And that figure is only something that's increasing. With that in mind, how might we leverage this largely growing population in order to accomplish a better world for everyone? So this youth strategy was launched during General Assembly in September, and before that in August during our DPI NGO conference centering around like multilateralism and how might we really make the case that it's actually important to work with and for and advocate for people who are not just yourself. How might we work together and more closely in a way that is true? So we produced the Youth Declaration, what we call it. So you got the Youth Strategy, which is what's in front of us, and the Youth Declaration. And so every year since 2016, so okay, for the past 3 years, like when DPI, when we had like our conference, it started in South Korea in Yeongju, when we decided to get together with all the young people who were present there to say like, well, in addition to like the world that we as NGOs, as non-governmental organizations are working for, what specifically do we want for young people? How might we amplify the voices of those who are marginalized or otherwise might not necessarily be heard? And so we produced the Youth Declaration. And so it's traveled like all over the world, but in essence it's a couple things. If you don't remember anything else, like there's this idea of people-centered multilateralism. And so multilateralism meaning you have several different kinds of players who are coming together in order to, one, like make decisions and work together, rather than saying as others might say like, oh well, actually I'm just here for me, I'm just here for my country, my people, my issue, etc. It's important that we as a planet work together, because the earth itself, the climate itself, the planet, the animals, they don't care about like what political affiliation you have or what your nationality is. Diseases don't necessarily care about like what kind of person are being infected. You know, like these things that we might use to divide us don't necessarily matter in the big scheme of things when it comes to the matter of like how might we survive. So people-centered multilateralism says it's not just the governments that like are impacting citizenry and that's how change happens, but it's also like from the bottom up, and we as people also have a role to play and a responsibility. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that like the core idea around like both of these documents is that like, one, we want to create environments where people thrive, and then two, we don't want decisions to be made any longer like that impact people without having the people who are impacted represented at the decision-making table. So no shade, but this means like no rooms being made with decisions being made about women's lives without women in the room at the table, or rooms where young people are being discussed where there aren't young people also represented. So one of the areas that really stand out to me as far as the Secretary General Youth Envoy's Youth Strategy is priority number 4 around like human rights and like the desire to have more young people represented on a parliamentarian level, more represented in government, more represented in those kind of decision-making spaces, so that we can advocate not just for young people but for everyone. If you get a chance to read the Youth Declaration, one thing that I think is so beautiful about it, like this is young people saying, this is the kind of world that we want to live in. But when you read the Youth Declaration, it also says that we want a world where like there's no discrimination across like any of the different specters. Like we're also discussing like how might we make life better for like people who are older than us, like for people who are different than us. This is not just to say like we want a better world for youth and only youth, but like how might we look out for everyone? And that kind of altruistic spirit is a spirit that we wish and we hope will like help permeate this area that we're in, will help permeate our nation states, our organizations, and our individual interactions as well. So when you read through this document, think not only about, okay, yeah, this is cool as far as like strategy goes, but think about how you and the people around you can like start to work toward implementation. And we're gonna get deeper into that as the conversation goes on today anyway. But I hope I'm helping you. Are we like contextualizing? Am I making sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Are we making sense? Okay, cool, thank you.
Thank you, Judea, for your amazing thoughts. I just wanted to say that between listening to you two and actually looking at the documents, it's interesting that the Youth Declaration, we wrote it, the conference and all of us that collaborated together, not really me, but the team, back in the summer. And we're part of a youth steering committee here at DPI, and we've been talking about these ideas for months now. And then now we have this Youth2030 agenda that gives us concrete propositions and solutions and ideas for how we can actually implement these like ideals that we have for ourselves and for each other. So just thinking about that, how do you think this Youth2030 agenda can actually impact your work personally within your respective organizations?
Ooh, so okay. I'm just gonna throw my hat in the ring. So we didn't like prepare with these questions, so it's not, oh, why, yes, thank you, Rosalie. Statement. But the first thing that came to mind, so I represent an organization called the International Youth Leadership Institute, and in a nutshell, we're about nurturing the next generation of world leaders who are like global citizens and care about the world, with specific focus on the African diaspora, but we want like a better world for like everyone, you know? And one thing that comes to mind for me is priority number 3 about like economic opportunity, and how like it just says that like it's one thing to be like a young person, like Erwin said, with ideas, but to be able to have those ideas funded. It's one thing to be a young person to get an education, but to be able to get a job with that education. These things are exceedingly important. And one solution that we found and are like working on is just like the idea that we should be trained not just to receive jobs, but be trained to make jobs too for other young people also. If some of us are trained in order to become employers rather than only just employees, it helps us to create the jobs that then other folks can occupy too. So we're centering around like entrepreneurship more so recently, and like financial literacy, and like how might we like start creating those opportunities for other people. That's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Arlene?
I love it. I'm still thinking about the power in that. When thinking about the document and how it might impact our work, I'm a strong advocate for having the document readily, on your phones or even printed. Walk around with it, and it's sort of, a framework, right? But it's also something very practical. If you have it and you know it, and you go up to the Secretary General and you're like, hey, I'm working on XYZ. This is how it supports this. You said you wanted to support that, so let's make it happen. you know? This has a deadline, and how that's received on the other end, and if you can even start a conversation with him personally is another story. But that's the goal. It says in this document that it's encouraging youth participation with all levels of the UN, including directly with the Secretary General. And it might be that your work personally does not actually have anything to do with the work of the Secretary General personally per se, but it could be impacting some, if not all, of the SDGs and different agencies in New York or outside of New York. So use it as a framework to guide your work, I would say. Even if you yourself are not youth, your work is impacting youth in some way. The fact that this has a deadline, 2030, just like the rest of the agenda, is quite impressive because it has a sense of urgency then. It's like, hey, we want to achieve this strategy in not 15 years like the agenda was given, but in 12 years. So there's an immediacy that goes with this document, and I think that's the power that it has for our work.
And I'm glad you brought up the SG and the SDGs because there's 17 of them. So whatever you do will fall under an SDG. Economic justice, peace, gender equality, everything that your NGO does, if you really bring it down and boil it down, it relates to one of the SDGs. I have a fun question for you ladies. So you ran into the SG and he says, let's have tea. And you're having tea with Secretary General, and you know, he obviously helped create this document with JAFMA, but so I'm thinking, how, like youth, we have a lot of knowledge that we can impact the UN with, we can share with others, and this document highlights that we have knowledge, but I wanted to pick your brains and see if you had tea with the Secretary General and you had 5 minutes to teach him something that he might not know, a man who's very experienced and has seen what's going on in the world. What can you teach him? You don't have to get the lesson, but give me like, what would you teach him about in 5 minutes that the SG would go, wow, like I didn't know about that, and now my work will be improved because I know something that I did not know.
You want to take that one?
I'm not sure about that, but I would share the work that we're collaboratively doing at the DPI as the steering committee and as NGO youth reps. I think that you know, the UN is very large. If you think about a college campus by US terms, or just a large institution, information isn't shared as efficiently and as effectively as it should be, and that's natural because it's such a large institution. I'm not saying that it should be fixed immediately, but you know, I'm sure he doesn't know about all of the things that we're doing, either as a cohort or individually. So I would talk to him collaboratively about the work that we're doing, and I'm sure that he doesn't know about all of it. So that would probably be my focus.
I would, facts, thank you. I think I would offer to him like just a reminder to remember that a lot of the wisdom that like these countries are seeking, there's like wisdom that like we as individuals and we have as people, like this wisdom has existed within our communities for centuries and or decades or even like millennia. I would encourage him to look more closely at NGOs, because like NGOs on a grassroots level are addressing some of the issues that countries at a higher level haven't been able to. Like, I really do believe that a lot of the solutions come from the bottom up, and there's like a grandma somewhere in a rural village who has been like implementing even like herbal medicines that have been like treating the people in her communities that just the world doesn't know about because maybe no one's asked. Or there's like people, even like I'm from Bed-Stuy, like we call it like where we live, like the hood, like but there are people in the hood who have been using really innovative methods to like address the issues that they have because maybe of like lacking areas in government, but like we thrive and still we survive and are able to like move forward with it. So I would encourage him to look more closely at NGOs, more closely at young people, and I would tell him to stop by one of our meetings. I mean, we have a lot of suggestions right there on a local and regional level. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Now you have me pondering.
Thanks. I think it's time we get to the second portion of our program. We're going to have working group discussions now. you all have a piece of paper that has these questions. So I'm going to split up the room. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
There's 8.
Yeah.
People
So I'm thinking like
per
2 rows.
Right.
So like 2 rows.
Plus a couple more.
Yeah. So basically, these 2 rows are going to be group 1, and you can kind of convene in this area. These last 2 rows plus those stragglers will be over with Steve. Who's here?
Aishu, Jadea.
Okay. So we'll have Aishu, me with Aishu here. Me, the last 2 rows, and the back row with Steve over there. These 2 front rows, and then you guys.
Could join any of these groups.
No, Swati, you should join the front row because there's less here.
Yeah. So
you
you're
side
gonna join
with these 2
this
front,
group.
and Jadea, and then you 2.
And you 3 could join.
Yeah, you
Nisha.
3 rows with Nisha.
You 3.
So you're going to get together with your groups, and the premise of the discussion is these questions are about your personal work with your NGOs, your community efforts that are not affiliated with NGOs, and there's 5 priorities that Erlene touched on that Youth 2030. So I want you guys to think about these 5 priorities which touch on hunger, education, economic justice, etc., and how has examples from your personal NGOs that have tackled it, but not only don't think inside the box about your personal NGO, but think bigger. What can you do collaborating with people in your group and NGOs in your group to actually bring these things into fruition? So we're gonna have about 15-20 minutes for that, and then we'll come back together and have a group discussion with what you guys have learned.
Alright, so you guys are called Buddhist Tzu Foundation. In Chinese, that translates to compassionate relief. We're like a humanitarian aid org. I'll go to my right.
My name is Teresa and I work for the Albert Schweitzer Institute.
So I want to know what you think as an older person following Kofi Annan, and I know that Gutierrez, when we remember
You want to be? Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is come up with answers for each of them, right? Maybe you can make like take notes what they say, and then we have to present it like in a creative way. Yeah, you're good with it.
I thought I'm leaving this evening. I have to go to the airport.
So thank you everyone for coming once again. So
You could join this group. Okay. Yeah? Okay.
welcome.
The human rights for those in need. Do any of you want to share any specific work that you guys are doing that relates to the Youth 2030 strategy? Or do you just want to jump straight into question number 2, which is really looking at best practices?
Our mission is to mobilize around the world.
I've been working on getting a bunch of different activities and classes set up for freshmen and older students to understand what the United Nations is, because I just recently moved from Australia, where I've been living as an Australian.
Children in poverty, children that can't go to schools because they're in poverty, provide meals to children that are in schools. A lot of kids who have
our ability to remain in like a peaceful environment, so like not
And which countries?
zones and just in general.
It's like in Thailand,
Is anyone involved in that kind of work?
Turkey. Anybody else want to contribute?
I can talk a little bit. I'm not a youth per se. I guess I'm young at heart, right? But I am the chief mentor to an organization called Rotary Youth for a Better World. Rotary Youth is 760,000 young people in 30,000 clubs around the world. But the Rotary Youth for a Better World is specifically here is about mobilizing the youth of the world to take on all the world's biggest problems, i.e. the SDGs. And the key principle that they're founded on is you don't go by what you think you can do, you go by what's needed or figure out what you have to do.
That's like
Anybody else?
Oh, can I have a... Yes.
Can I go first?
You're doing it?
To share out from our
Yes.
group? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm like terrified that I'll forget like things halfway because I'm gonna like.
2.5 minutes, and I will time you.
Okay. So we came from a variety of different orgs doing various activities. So we just jumped straight into best practices. Things that we really looked at was like, how do other youth access information about the UN? And sometimes there's this apathy and disinterest, and so we had this idea that like we first need to shift the paradigm from this notion of I as a youth am not heard to I am heard as a youth, and there is something I can do, right? And if you can instill that message within those you work with, it becomes a lot easier to talk about other things like the Youth 2030 agenda. Knowing and understanding that this document is a promise from the United Nations to the youth, there's not necessarily anything that's fully developed yet. It's still very much work in progress, but how we as youth can really implement and work together with the UN, I think we really identified that on an international level, the space is very stuffed. But if you go to the regional level, at the regional IANYDs and the country levels with the UN country teams, your voice as a youth and your ability to impact that space and shape discourse becomes a lot stronger. When we look at really trying to hold people accountable, I think it's important to have concrete work that's being done on the ground as youth-led, and then bring that work back up to whatever level of the UN that you want to share and engage with. We had a couple questions that I thought were really interesting that I'll throw out, and then I'll pass it to Tori. But the first one was like, how do we...
Can you hold your questions for later?
Yeah, sure. Okay, we'll save the questions for later then. But then we have one final paradigm shift, what I think is like a beautiful way to cap off everything that we discussed.
So basically, we're talking about the last question about.
A little louder.
We're talking. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we were talking about the last question about how we can maintain and grow partnerships, and we were trying to figure out ways to connect. And I was just saying that basically, as we've gotten older, we've sort of shifted from this idea of being a community to being the one to get ahead, to, you know, you have to always be on your grind to be better than the next person, to be the top, to be the best of the best. And we forget that as human beings, we are made to be in a community, and like we actually thrive better in a community than we do by ourselves. It is very lonely at the top, so trying to bring us all together, because once you realize that, you know, because I come from Nigeria, my parents are Nigerian, I know that people in Nigeria don't have the resources and the ability to be who they are, the potential that they have, but I have that chance, and the fact that they don't have that chance hurts me. So when they hurt, I hurt. When they don't have, I don't have, even if I may physically have. And I feel like we all need to realize that as a community and as youth, that if the other youth don't have, we don't have. If they're hurting, we're hurting as well. And that is the most important partnership that we can have. Like, we are all human, therefore we can have to partner on that particular level. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. That was great. So another group, who else?
So pretty much in our group we went around, we actually cover all of the 6 continents except for Antarctica. So we have representation from all of the continents here. So pretty much we have someone doing work in India, a youth-led organization that has a virtual SWAT, and what they do is that they also have like a help hotline for youth. We have another individual that's based in Ecuador that actually works with indigenous youth, and she teaches them about the SDGs not only in Spanish but in Quechua. We also have another individual from Nigeria that actually does very early intervention work for children that are using drugs, so from a very young age, trying to get them to stop using it. And as well as we talked somewhat about just like local organizations in the inner city and how they have a really strong communication system in order to keep the youth engaged, because you know the youth get really distracted, especially when they're teenagers or in their preteens, and so they are constantly communicating with them through text messages, Facebook, Twitter, calling, because sometimes the parents can't be there to provide them with the necessary guidance. So having a really strong communication system for the youth that you're engaging is very important. And I think what we ended off with the fact that, you know, when talking about youth mobilizing resources, which youth exactly are you talking about? Because I think that people make the decision for the youth as to which ones are going to access certain opportunities, whether that's a scholarship or information about a university that's looking for specific youth that fit a specific demographic or description. I think many times adults make decisions on behalf of the kids and try to convince other adults that that child or that teenager can't because they don't have good grades, because maybe they have ADHD, because they don't behave in the way that you think a good student is or a good citizen is. And it's not your personal decision to make it's not your place to make decisions about someone else's life trajectory and what they are capable of doing. And I think many times they try to determine another individual's capacity and their capability, and that's not your place. And I think when it comes to working with the youth as an adult, you're going to have to put your biases to the side, because it's not about what you think or what your mommy told you growing up or what you were taught in your family. Different cultures react to different things in different ways, and it's not up to the youth leader to make that decision for someone who's younger than them. You need to let the youth demonstrate to you, because they might not necessarily be looking or live their life in the way that you think that they should do it. I mean, you have kids out in Nigeria who are probably addicted to drugs and they're very, very young. Someone might think, oh, that child's not going anywhere because their brain is damaged or something, right? But maybe not. Maybe through some of these interventions, you can save that life. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think. When you talk about youth mobilizing resources, which youth are you talking about?
That's great. Thank you for that. Thank you. Especially speaking about agency, and youth have the capacity to make their own decisions and be wise in those decisions, and they know themselves. So that makes a lot of sense. Who else is?
So we also had organizations doing many different things. Mm-hmm. A really big two that we mentioned were the Rotary Youth for a Better World, which kind of mobilize youth to tackle issues needs relating to the SDGs. And also this organization that works in areas like Thailand and Turkey to give them refugee access to education and health services. Best practices and lessons learned to operationalize youth. You said that goals are very, very important, if you have goals, they kind of help to strengthen and maintain partnerships always, because everyone is working towards one thing, and fragmentation doesn't occur, so that we could attract economic resources and resources from other organizations that may otherwise be confused sort of by fragmentation or a million different NGOs doing different things. But another thing that's of course really important are grassroots efforts done by NGOs. We had one NGO that worked in Nepal, and they kind of went door to door in these wards to make sure that children weren't working there to help stop child labor, which is very inspirational. A way that youth can spread word in their communities. Social media, of course, is very important, and I think also in this day and age there's so many youth activists doing so many important works, and that kind of reaches out to youth. Youth recognize that and see their own running initiatives like that. I think that's a way that we can mobilize youth and the resources that they have access to, especially through social media, to really tackle issues of the Youth 2030 strategy. Another thing is being in the schools. Schools are very important, formal or informal education. They're great. They're an incubator for growing and shaping minds. And I think if we get these ideas early on into youth, it's an earlier start. You can early on start mobilizing these people to create the change that we talked about in these strategies.
I have one more. Yes.
Our group definitely discussed a lot of what was in all the other groups. We had a very diverse group of organizations represented. Something that we definitely touched upon is providing that platform for youth instead of speaking on behalf of youth. We can't decide what's important for them. They need to be able to voice their own concerns and make their own priorities. I really like what was said over here is I am a youth and will be heard. We need to make sure that we're providing that platform so they can be heard. social media was also discussed in our group as a way to help that, but also the concern of loss of interest and selectivism was also discussed. We need to be able to continue this conversation to make sure that it doesn't become another one of those posts that you always see. It's not just a list of these 17 goals or the 5 goals within the plan. We need to make sure that they're concrete and show the examples that are within every single society throughout the country, or throughout the world rather, to make sure that these are real world examples and that we're giving the platform for these voices to be continued to be heard.
That was a lot. I don't know if you guys got that, but does anyone from one group have any comments or suggestions about what someone else was saying from another group?
I have a thought to kick things off. Just from what I'll stand. So from what I heard just now from this group, yeah, that makes so much sense as far as like how some people might want to make a change but like maybe lazy about it, and so like slacktivism is a thing where people maybe just say like, oh, I'll share a post on Facebook, there, I've changed the world, okay, cool, back to not recycling or whatever. I think that's a really good point, and I'm really glad that came out.
Yeah, lack of interest was also mentioned in another group too, so it's interesting how you're all thinking about it on the same page. And just a quick comment, we had a meeting last week called like orientation, and we are NGOs. We are civil society that works for a non-governmental organization. So we are not the voice of the UN, but we are like that flute where the music comes through and we're like pointing it to the right direction. So you're right, one post won't make a difference, but it's up to us to bring that one post. How many friends we have on any social media platform that would not read about this information? So if everyone in this group shared something, it's thousands of people that have looked upon that post. And not saying that limit your advocacy to just digitally forwarding and sharing things, but it's getting the voice out there, and that's a way that you can teach others about the SDGs, someone said about that, informing them about the work that they're actually doing and how it actually correlates to the UN principles and the 5 from the plan. That's my thought. But anyone else has?
If I may, just
sure.
Annie Deng online.
Right. Hi, Annie.
I'm
going to wave to the camera. Wave at Annie.
Yoanna's tuning in from Germany also.
Oh, and Joanna.
She has a comment. She thinks that we should lobby education entities with curriculum control to add the SDGs into the curriculums. We can start with a one-day concentrated lesson plan, for example, on March 14th, which is Pi Day. So that's just a comment from Annie online.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicole Insasti. I'm from Ecuador. Sorry for the people that is in the back. Sorry for my back. Okay, I want to apologize if my English is don't understand for all. I hope that you can understand.
No, it's good.
All right. So I want to share about also a comment about the social media, because as my partner said, especially in my experience, I have the big problem that the social media is not a resource for me when I was training to indigenous people. I mean, it's a big resource that we have. Like a consequence of the globalization or the innovation of technology, but what happened with the people that don't have access to the information and also don't want to access to the information about their costume or their tradition. So maybe the training for us like young people, it could be more and how we can share with them like new techniques or measures that we can implement. Okay, I know that we have a lot of countries, but I am involved to work with indigenous people. For this reason, I talk a lot about, because I have 26 groups of indigenous people. We talk Quechua. It's not Quechua. Quechua is from Peru. So we talk Quechua for don't miss the language. So for the indigenous people, any technique or any innovation, like with younger people, we talk in this language for don't miss the costume. So I share with you. You can research information about my wonderful country. So I hope that you are interested to work and know how we work with young people, indigenous people, because it's other reality. They have also consequences of the migration, because we are here, indigenous people also come to the big cities, consequences of the migration, so we also have this problem with them. So we work these techniques. So I want to share that we, with young people, we need to work also with this vulnerable group, that is young people that don't have like access like us to the information, go to a computer, and so what is the next meeting or something like that. Or also the discrimination, the language, and all the things are different from them.
Thank you so much
thank
for sharing. Thank you. Somewhere in the Youth 2030, it talks about when creating change, and I'm paraphrasing, being culturally relevant. So I think that's something we're speaking to a lot too, because we're here talking about social media, but we're in the Western world where, you know, everyone has 4G, and if you don't, get it. So I think it's good for us to always think about communities that don't have this kind of access, that the language is a language barrier, there's a technological barrier. Someone once told me a story, and I'm not gonna name NGOs, also I don't know, but some NGO went to a Native community and gave the chief a stack of laptops, like, look, we're giving you MacBooks, and anyone would go crazy for MacBooks. And you know what the chief did? He used it as a chair. He legit sat on 10 MacBooks because he's like, I need water, not computers. So I think that's something that's interesting for us to think about, and you all touched upon it, and your NGOs are thinking about these things. But it's good to share with us the information, because when we're creating our thing and we're social media heavy, then we listen to someone like you and we're like, wait, how can we give you the message in a timely fashion, and also considering your restraints? Anyone else? Yeah.
So like, going on a lot of the points that we've sort of spoken about, especially with the social media thing, I think it's very important to remember that even in America, social media is very much curated to one like cultural group. You know, as an African American, like the technical sense, because I'm African, but I'm also American, but I'm Nigerian, it's very confusing. I've noticed that my narrative, or the narrative of African students, or the narrative of first generation African students, isn't heard. So in that case, I noticed like a lot of, like, we have a Black student union in our school, an African Caribbean student union in our school, but we feel very removed from the rest of the school, and from basically a lot of the community service activities on campus, because we are not heard in the first place. So why should we go help other people? And I feel like it's very important for us to also deal with that part in social media as well. And maybe, I think that group was talking about like what youth matters, like what youth are you talking to? Because it seems right now that there's only one youth that everyone is directing their information to. And it's, to be honest with you, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's my youth. It doesn't feel like my friend's youth. And then we sort of sit there going, we don't matter, so like I'm just gonna sit back and not care about this. But even though I know like we do matter and we should care about this. And that's what I was saying before about the hurting, everyone is hurting, because we're just keeping everyone in like the dark and cutting them off into different sections. And I don't know who made that comment online about, you know, maybe adding to the curriculum. Maybe the first step is to include other histories in the curriculum, so we understand, like, you know, different cultures' histories and their contribution to America, or the other countries that they've come from, because they did contribute. They're part of the narrative, and if you feel heard, you want to help people. I mean, like, that's like the biggest problem. Yeah.
You just went to church?
Here? Yes. So this is sort of bouncing off both about, along with social media. Something that we brought up in the group was about a lot of the times when we focus so much on social media, which is of course a great resource because we can reach so many people, is we tend to forget the importance of conversation, not just here, but bringing the conversation out. Speaking for my youth, 18 and younger, a lot of the times we just scroll through. Just scroll. I don't bother clicking. So sharing a post on social media depends on the other person to click. But when you start a conversation, unless they're plugging their ears, they're listening because they're right there. So, making sure that in your own personal community, you're reaching everyone that you can reach, bringing it up at the dinner table, Thanksgiving dinner, holidays when families together, and then hoping that that perks up their ears and their interest to spread. I mean, word of mouth is so powerful, and I feel like that's a lot of the times gets forgotten with social media. So again, with access to social media, some people have access to it and then aren't taking notice to things that are being shared or that could change their own mind or their entire life. So yeah, keeping the conversation not just here but out.
Oh, sorry. If I may interject, because I think it's a good follow-up to what you just said. We do have 2 comments from online. Again, let's wave to Joanna. And Annie, again, I think it's very complimentary to what you mentioned about social media, in fact, being complementary to civic participation, and that's exactly what Joanna states. I agree with you, Rosaleni, but that also means that we must make civil society participation and representation inclusive to marginalized groups as well, as to ensure that every voice is heard and reached through social media, and not only the ones who are active anyway, youth or not. And it almost seems like they were having a conversation online without us, but they're bringing it here, because then Annie followed up saying, always a fight, not just to preach to the choir, but to reach to those not seeking. So it's a question for us to keep in mind, I guess. Congrats to them for contributing. Thank you.
I actually have a question from Annie. Hi, Annie again. And other friends that are joining us that aren't adding to the conversation but are listening.
Yeah.
Annie's question, and then we could jump to yours, would be, sounds like Youth Strategy wants to establish youth groups in each UN entity. How do we reduce redundancy and passion wasted in friction between the systems?
May you repeat the question?
Sure. Sounds like the Youth Strategy wants to establish youth groups in each UN entity. How do we reduce redundancy and passion wasted in friction between the system? How do we reduce redundancy and passion wasted in friction between the system?
Yeah. I think that's something you addressed right before about, you know, some NGOs wanting to do things that have already been done, to establish their own name, to work as individuals because they want to have their name, prominent related to that cause. But I think that working together, and I think that the need for country groups and regional groups is necessary, because if you don't have someone there, that means they're not represented, and that's the basis for democracy, right? Which, of course, it has its faults, but you need representation. You need a focal point in Latin America. You need one in Asia. You need one in Africa. Complementing the conversation that we had about if they're not included in the discussion, then whatever solution you throw at them is not valid because they're not participating in helping you achieve that solution. So I think that it's interesting to hear your thoughts related to reducing the redundancies, but I do think that having a focal point in every region is prevalent and necessary. Otherwise, it's counterintuitive to what we're talking about when we're talking about including all youth voices. So,
and just to highlight, when you say focal point, it's not like one person representing the entire voice of Latino America. It's hundreds of people on the ground level that are communicating to this one person, and then that person is the voice. Just like we have ambassadors here that represent each country and each mission, the same way that the focal point would represent the community and the country and the region as a whole, not their personal agenda, which actually might be different than yours. But they're sharing their own thoughts. Anyone has any questions?
I know we had some that came out of the group, but I think they've been pretty well echoed. That notion of like, how do we ensure that like we can really lift up the voices of those who aren't being heard and reach those populations that might not necessarily be touched by the UN already, as one question that was already thrown out. There was a nice question on how we're actually going to measure this, right? Because if you look at the youth strategy, it's kind of like broken into 2 pieces, right? Like the UN's envisioning of how it's going to be like a agency for youth, and then the second being like, here's what we prioritize to do for youth. But in both segments of the youth strategy, there's not actually any clear set deliverables and like how they're going to measure that yet. And the understanding that it's a process and it's something that's still being developed. and then also looking at like, because we have this timeline of like till 2030 to actually get there, by the time it actually happens, we're not going to be youth either, right? So how can we ensure that we're engaging with the children of this generation to ensure that when they become like that defined UN language of you are now 18 and above and you're considered youth, that this platform that is being developed is truly what they wish to see for their generation.
I'm not really the youth generation, but I'd just like to make an observation here, because I've been listening to what you said and I've been talking to a number of you for several months here. One thing I really get the feel, I don't hear scale. The problems, I see the SDGs, they're humongous. And I see a lot of relatively small initiatives being done. And one of my concerns is, I don't know how many of you are looking at the things that are happening in the future. I don't know if you're listening to the people who are talking about that we are going to have a humongous worldwide useless class. That's the word they're now using, the useless class. And there's discussions, how are we going to get rid of half the world population? There are powerful people that are thinking that way at this stage. And if you go around looking here, how do we save this village? And there's people looking and saying, how do we wipe that state out? You're not doing anything good. So that we actually have, we're working on a paper called When is Doing Good Not Good? And when you're doing something good that actually detracts from a better good or a bigger good, you're actually not helping. So my only thought here is, please take a look at the scale of the problems out there. Get together. You got so much brain power going on here. Get together and figure out, how do you put your brains together and come up with things that are going to reach the scale? How are you going to go about going and giving everybody a chance of literacy? You got 10, maybe 15, maximum 20 years to do that before AI and automation is going to eliminate the value of human labor. What's going to happen to all these people you're trying to help when human labor has no value? So think about that. Do it. Put your plans together. Come up with an agenda. Set real goals. And you know what? Don't go off and set a goal and everybody run off and do your own thing. Set a goal and figure out how you can work together to accomplish those goals. And if you do that, you can truly change the whole world and change that formula so that people see purpose in their lives. And we don't have to be afraid of these future changes that aren't going to impact me, but they're going to impact you and they're going to impact your children. And so you gotta start thinking big. Somebody once said, if your dreams aren't scaring you, you're not dreaming big enough. So start looking for those dreams that scare you. Thanks.
2023 implementation of robotics, service industries focus.
Maybe like 3 more. Do we have any more questions or comments that we can maybe take about 2 more before we close? Nisha?
Yeah, I wanted to, what was your name? Alicia was saying that how they did something in Nepal. That work was that they were trying to, talk about child labor. But what happened was kids were working in a village, right? And the young people went and talked about, the adversity of child labor and how to prevent it. And they were going through one house at a time. And when one house did not have any child labor, they put a flag there.
It's a whole ward.
Yeah, why don't you explain? Yeah.
So I used to, it was just an internship for a municipality, but then what happened was we were facilitating this group of little children's, underprivileged children's, and one of the girls comes up with an idea, a 9-year-old comes up with an idea of why we're sitting here every week and talking about it, why aren't we going out there and doing something about it? And then she comes up with an idea. We just go and we knock on the door and we ask, how many people are you living here in? Is there child labor going on? We just go and badger people. Unless you do that, the problem's not going to be solved. Well, we heard what she had to say and we discussed amongst ourselves and we brought up the paperwork and we were wearing IDs and we were knocking on the doors, of course, but well, one ward has 140 houses, and you complete that 140 houses within 3 weeks, and it's free of child labor. You put a green flag in it, and then
that's it. That's just how it starts. You just go out there and do it. But the big thing here was a child, an underprivileged child who's not gone to school, coming up with this idea because there was a group of people sitting around her listening to her. So in the same way, we have universities which have organizations and little clubs. They actually come together every single week and sit down and talk about global affairs, talk about sustainable development goals and everything in classrooms and in social media. But the thing is, they don't come up to this level, you know. They don't get heard. So that's the thing. Somehow, some sort of way that we can bring these people together who actually do have ideas and who want to, you know, who are very aggravated to do something about it. So yeah.
Thanks for being one of their voices, at least today.
Yeah, I think that's our role. We find groups of people that are doing amazing things. And one thing we saw this during the DPI conference, that a lot of young people wanted to come, but they didn't have resources. So instead of their voices being neglected because they didn't have the financial means, we made sure to create a conversation like with a liaison that's there or with the internet. I know not everyone has internet, but trying to create that line of communication. So I think it's up to us, and when you already know these kids and this youth and what they're doing, gather a story and then bring it to, you know, a chat series or another space that we can have like this and share with us what they're doing and then share some information. Like that's how we are going to get moving, and we can collaborate together and we can increase our scale so we can tackle these monumental issues. So do you guys have any closing things? I'm speechless because you guys have so many amazing ideas, and you have the energy and the passion and the empathy for working with people, for working towards these SDGs, the intellect to come together and to create these very innovative ideas that by yourself you can't do it, but obviously together in a group, like, it's amazing.
Well, I'd just say, you know, it's not only monumental but historical. I think this is the first time that it's been put in writing ever in UN history that youth are important, and to this level. And it took many, many months and many years to put it together. And this is a part of history too, because we're sitting here together and we're talking about it, and we're establishing ourselves as part of it as well. So thank you for being here, and it starts with us, and it starts right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati, for organizing this. Thank you, DPI.
Thank you to the Youth Steering Committee. I just want to thank everybody. Tell me, I was so inspired. Who's having conversations with their family and friends about this? Not in social media, having conversations. Thanksgiving is next week. Who's going to talk about this? I didn't see enough hands. I mean, come on. Who's going to talk about this? Who's going back and discussing what we just learned? Who's going to have informative conversations, how we can work together? Social media is not the only way. When I was growing up, we had no social media. I got email when I started here in '94. That was the first time I got my own email address. We didn't have computers. We didn't have cell phones. I had a brick cell phone. Yeah, but there was nothing what we have today. So I think social media is great and all the technology is great, but guess what? Having a conversation, that's even better. So go out there, talk to your constituents, talk to your family, talk to your community. Okay, that's the only way we're going to achieve this, because we are youth.
We are.
I'm youth too. Yes. All right, I want to thank everybody, and yes, everyone has to sign in, so please, there's only 21 signatures in there, and there's more than 50 of us here. So if you haven't signed in, sign in, and keep an eye out for proposals for the chat series for the upcoming season. I expect a lot of you to work together and come up with ideas and send it over to us, okay? Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody. Jadea, Roslani, Erlene, Aishu, Steve, and Nisha. Thank you, and of course to our wonderful staff here in DPI NGO Relations. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.